Since Repair Clinic encourages you to perform this procedure safely, a warning icon will appear when you should use caution. Many leaf blower repairs will require some disassembly of the product. Before you attempt this, make sure the engine has cooled and the on-off switch is in the off position. We recommend emptying the fuel tank as well. To reach the air filter, unthread the wing nuts counterclockwise to detach the air filter cover. To access carburetor components, remove the air filter, then use a T27 Torx bit to unthread the two mounting bolts, securing the filter base and carburetor. You can use pliers to help detach the throttle cable. Note the orientation of the fuel lines, then detach them from the carburetor ports. You can now replace the carburetor or install new carburetor components like a primer bulb or gasket. Reinstall the carburetor by first attaching the fuel lines to the appropriate ports. Hook the throttle cable onto the lever. Confirm the baffle is aligned in the air filter base, then insert the bolts. Position the carburetor intake gasket on the bolts. Align the carburetor, followed by the outlet gasket. Now position the assembly and thread the mounting bolts. Replace the air filter. Realign the filter cover and thread the wing nuts to secure. To replace any throttle control components, first unthread the retaining knob screw to release the throttle control from the blower tube clamp. Unthread the 4 screws securing the 2 halves of the throttle control. Lift off the right half. To replace the trigger, lift out the trigger and detach the throttle cable. Transfer the spring from the old throttle trigger to the new one. Attach the throttle cable. Now, keeping the spring depressed, align the trigger on the post. Confirm that the wires and cable retainer are positioned in the channel. Make sure the mounting pin is in place. Then realign the 2 halves of the throttle control and thread the screws. Reposition the throttle control in the blower tube clamp. Then thread and tighten the retaining knob screw. Keep in mind, you can rotate the throttle cable adjustment screw clockwise to increase tension on the cable, or counterclockwise to decrease the tension. To uninstall the starter assembly, unthread the 4 screws securing the starter. Next, remove the wire and boot from the spark plug. Unthread the 5 screws securing the engine cover. Pry off the cover. This may require some effort. Use a 3/4 inch socket or a spark plug wrench to unthread the spark plug. Confirm that the engine piston is in the down position. Then insert a cord into the cylinder to prevent the piston from moving. You can now use a strap wrench to help unthread the starter pawl assembly. To replace a starter pawl, use a small flathead screwdriver to remove the retaining clip to release the old pawl. Install the new starter pawl by aligning the spring with the prongs facing up. Recoil the spring and insert the pawl into the housing. Slide the retaining clip on to secure. Thread the housing onto the motor shaft and use the strap wrench to tighten. Remove the cord from the cylinder and rethread the spark plug. Be careful not to damage the plug by over-tightening. With the engine cover removed, you can uninstall the muffler by using a T30 Torx bit to unthread the 2 mounting bolts securing the muffler assembly. Reinstall the muffler assembly by first inserting the mounting bolts. Then align the heat shield. Position the assembly on the engine and thread the bolts to secure. You can now reposition the engine cover. Thread and tighten the screws. Reattach the wire and boot to the spark plug. Continue the reassembly by realigning the starter, making sure the pulley engages with the starter pawls. Thread the screws to secure the assembly. To access blower housing components, set the leaf blower on its side and use the T27 Torx bit to unthread the 4 screws, securing the fuel tank retainer. Set the fuel tank and retainer aside. Next, unthread the 9 screws, securing the 2 halves of the blower housing. Detach the cable and static discharge wire from the housing retaining clip. Unthread the screw to fully release the discharge wire from the engine. You can now separate the two halves of the blower housing to reach the blower fan and flywheel. If you need to replace the fan cover or air intake grid, detach the elbow blower tube and set the frame upright. Unsnap the foam pad. You can now unthread the 4 screws securing the fan cover. Unthread the safety strap screw to fully release the cover. To uninstall the air intake grid, use pliers to depress the retaining clips at the top and bottom of the frame to detach the grid. Use a 1/4-inch deep well socket to release the side retaining tabs to fully remove the grid. Reinstall or replace the air intake grid by aligning the tabs and clips, then snap the grid into position. Reinstall the fan cover by first threading the screw to secure the safety strap to the cover. Fully reposition the cover and thread the 4 screws. Snap the foam pad into place. Lay the frame back down and position the elbow blower tube. Continue the reassembly by rejoining the 2 halves of the blower housing. Rethread the screw to secure the static discharge wire to the engine. Secure the discharge wire and the cable in the housing retaining clip. Rethread all of the screws to secure the 2 halves of the blower housing. Realign the retainer on the fuel tank, then position the assembly on the frame. Confirm that the washers are in place on the screws, then thread the 4 screws to secure the retainer. With the reassembly complete, refill the fuel tank, and your leaf blower should be ready for use.